Welcome to the World Bank Praxis discussion series. I'm Auskar Surbakti. I'd like to welcome our audience here in Sydney, those watching on APAC online and listening on radio, and everyone watching in Honiara, Dili and Port Moresby. At times of conflict and transition, many countries turn to international assistance to help stop and prevent the violence, save lives and rebuild societies. While this help is often welcome and delivered with the best intentions, too often the drivers or motives of violent conflict are misunderstood or ignored, and local, regional and global actions don't align. The stakes couldn't be higher. By 2015, almost a third of the world's poor will live in fragile and conflict-affected communities. These are important issues for the Pacific. It's been a decade since the arrival of the Regional Assistance Mission to Solomon Islands, or RAMSI. But what has been and what will be the legacy of RAMSI? Last year, East Timor celebrated a decade of its independence as the United Nations Integrated Mission in Timor-Leste officially withdrew at the end of 2012. How can conflict-affected countries break cycles of violence, low trust or weak institutions? What role can international actors play, and how can aid be most effective and legitimate in these settings? To discuss these issues and more, we're joined by Tarcisius Kabutaulaka, who was part of the independent assessments team in Solomon Islands, Rebecca Bryant, Assistant Director General at AusAID, Professor Anthony Zwei from the School of Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales, and Joseph Foukona, formerly part of the Solomon Islands Law Reform Commission and now at the Australian National University. And thank you all for joining us. Joseph, we know there are many examples of international interventions in conflict zones, but closer to home, RAMSI is the obvious case study. Can you tell us what RAMSI is for those of us who don't know?
The conflict in the Solomons started in 1998 to 2000, and then it translated into law and order problems from 2000 to 2003. So the state was incapable of dealing with issues around law and order. So there was a multilateral agreement in 2003, and then there was a legal framework which established the basis for the RAMSI intervention. And the RAMSI mandates are quite specific. First, it focuses on looking at addressing law and order issues in the Solomons, and then also around the economy, as well as strengthening the machinery of government. It's been there for the last 10 years.
Rebecca, what has RAMSI achieved over the last 10 years?
Well, I think the first thing to say about RAMSI is that it was a security and development intervention, and as such it was well ahead of its time. So RAMSI was quite visionary in the way it was established. First of all, the staging for RAMSI was quite deliberate. So RAMSI's first job was to address law and order problems, then to establish a functioning economy, then address challenges in the institutions of government. It moved from there over the years to address longer term challenges, and it did that quite deliberately in that order. RAMSI had the support of the region, hence it was a regional assistance mission. It was very well resourced. RAMSI over the 10 years has cost in excess of 2 billion Australian dollars. And it was consensual, so it was an intervention with the consent of the Solomon Islands government. So I wanted to set that context because it goes to whether or not RAMSI has or has not been successful. And there has, it's the 10-year anniversary, and there has been quite a lot of discussion about whether RAMSI was successful or not successful. Should it have left earlier? Should it stay longer? It set out to achieve functioning institutions of government, a functioning economy, a safe environment for the citizens of Solomon Islands, and a functioning law and justice system. And as such, it's been incredibly successful. I mean, it defined its own success and it achieved the goals that it set. So after 10 years, yes, RAMSI, I would say, has been successful because we do have a system of government that functions, public servants that get paid and that do the jobs they've been asked to do, a police force that, you know, is maintaining law and order, an economy that is stable and growing, and all of these things are what RAMSI set out to achieve.
I'd like to quote RAMSI's first special coordinator, the Australian diplomat Nick Warner, who on the morning of the 24th of July in 2003 said the following: "While law and order is being restored, we will work with you to bring stability to the budget, to rebuild the machinery of government and restore the delivery of essential government services to people. The conditions for economic growth and improved living standards will be put in place." Tarcisius, referring to the quote that I just read out, the original aims of RAMSI, do you think they've been achieved?
I think to a certain extent they have. When we talk about RAMSI, there is a tendency to treat RAMSI as a single entity. I think it's important to realize that there are different components of RAMSI, and there are aspects of RAMSI that have achieved a great deal. Take, for instance, the correctional institutions have functioned very well. They lived up to UN standards, and they're doing pretty well at the moment. But there are aspects of RAMSI that haven't worked very well. Morgue, for instance. Before I move on to that, RAMSI has three major pillars. There is the law and justice sector. It looks at economic governance, looking at the Ministry of Finance, revenue collection, management of revenue, and so forth. And then the third pillar is what is called machinery of governments, which is very, very complicated because it involves a whole lot of things. So there are, while on the whole, RAMSI is doing very well, there are aspects of RAMSI that's not achieved the objective that it set out to do. And I think the important point raised earlier on is building capacity so that the Solomon Islands government and Solomon Islands as a nation state will be able to sustain those things in the future. Take, for instance, the Solomon Islands police force is doing very, very well compared to the force that we had in 2003 when RAMSI came in. So that's a huge achievement. However, if you look at it, about 60% of the Solomon Islands police resources is met by RAMSI funding. And so the question arises whether or not the Solomon Islands government is willing to compensate to have that kind of police force, or whether it has the capacity to do that. So if RAMSI pulls out, what happens to a police force that no longer has access to the resources? The other thing is that whilst there's a lot of talk about capacity building, what's happened over the years is we've seen a lot of capacity addition rather than capacity building. And so you add a lot of advisors, a lot of people working in line ministries such as Ministry of Finance, in accountability institutions such as the Auditor General's Office, the Leadership Code Commission. So you have an addition of capacity rather than a building of capacity. And in cases where you do build resources, human resources in particular, a lot of them, after they've got the experience, find jobs elsewhere that pay better, particularly in law and justice, for instance. A lot of lawyers who have had experience through RAMSI mentoring have moved on to private practice because it's better paying over there. So it's the ability of the government to bring in that capacity and keep it that is at the moment not there.
If we fast forward from that initial quote, and last month RAMSI's current special coordinator, Nicholas Koppel, wrote that RAMSI has quickly dealt with lawlessness and conflict. It arrested leaders of the tensions, enforced a prohibition on firearms, and began rebuilding the Royal Solomon Islands police force. Solomon Islands now has no militias, no militant training camps, and no confirmed trade in illicit weapons. Over the past decade, the economy has grown steadily and by over 80% in real terms. So very positive developments there. Rebecca, RAMSI's design has been held up as a model of what international intervention can look like. Why is that, do you think?
Well, again, I think the first thing to say about that is they are notable achievements given the time frame that we're talking about. But I think everybody knows that to rebuild a country from the state that Solomon Islands was in 2003 it's a generational task. Some might say a two-generational task. The World Bank Development Report for 2011 said that to bring a country back from a conflict situation will take at least 30 years. So for RAMSI to achieve what it has in those 10 years is a great achievement, but the work is nowhere near done. Arguably, it's time for RAMSI to step aside and to allow the Solomon Islands government to take the lead, and they won't be alone in that. Bilateral donors like the Australian aid program will continue to support the government to take things forward.
Anthony, are we asking too much of RAMSI in a decade? What's a more realistic timeframe for these situations?
I think the point has been made that conflicted societies and post-conflict societies will have long-standing problems and difficulties. So one certainly needs a long-term commitment. I think one needs to appreciate that. One needs to appreciate that there's both the need for resources and support and various forms of engaging in partnership with emerging countries over time, and that those that are donors and key players in the international community need to release a little bit of the control that they exert in order to enable and actually really support the emergence of local leadership and institutions, governance ability, and the ability to actually start setting agendas and shaping the needs that are relevant to particular contexts. So I think, RAMSI's played an important role and it sort of set the tone for that, but I think one should learn that one needs longer term engagement, changing types and forms of engagement, that during those processes one should be actively seeking to support local leadership and capacity and governance ability, the involvement of civil society, and welcome in a way those changing structures and relationships between an emerging and transitional country and those that hopefully can support its further development.
Okay, let's look at that issue of capacity building. Joseph, from a security point of view, with the military now leaving and RAMSI police having withdrawn from operational roles across most of the country, there's now, I guess, more pressure on the Royal Solomon Islands police force, isn't there? But is that force ready?
I think it's really not a question on whether the Royal Solomon Islands police is ready. I think it's a question on whether they are now prepared to take up the challenge in this transition phase. And I think one of the biggest challenges of the force is around resources. And if you compare the RAMSI setup, its performance, capability, and ability, you can see that there's much more strength as compared to the Royal Solomon Islands police. Their performance measured against their ability, there are still issues around.
Okay, I guess on that point, the RAMSI forces has maintained strong approval ratings consistently, with some figures quoting it at 86% of Solomon Islanders approving of the force. Why do you think this is the case? This is a question to you all. Why is there such a high approval rating to the RAMSI forces? Can we expect something similar for the local police force?
I guess it's public perception and a level of trust also are factors that impact on the ratings. Mm-hmm. And I guess it's coming back to my previous point regarding performance and the level of response to reports or incidents in the country. If you compare it with RAMSI and the Royal Solomon Islands Police, RAMSI are more responsive compared to our police. And one example is, I think 2 days ago there was a incident whereby there was a theft report, and a police was called to the scene to arrest. And when the police called the police station for a police truck, there was no fuel. So they ended up transporting the culprit by taxi. So, I mean, that's sort of an example of issue on resource.
Tarcisius, should the numbers be reversed eventually? Obviously, when RAMSI forces do completely go, do you hope that Solomon Islanders will have a similar amount of faith in the local force?
Well, one would hope so. It's a long way to go, given the experiences that people had during the conflict period, where there were certain elements of the police force that were involved in a lot of not really good things. And so people who have had that experience, I think, still don't trust the police force. And so there is a lot of work to be done. I am certain that there have been a lot of improvement in the Royal Solomon Islands police since RAMSI came in. But we still need to translate that into people's confidence in the force. The other thing to add on to what Joe was saying is that if you see a lot of the media coverage, particularly media coverage about police responses, they tend to largely be about RAMSI. And RAMSI has a huge media, public relations media, that talks about RAMSI a lot more than it talks about the police, Royal Solomon Islands Police. So you have a public that hears more about what RAMSI is doing rather than what the Royal Solomon Islands Police is doing. Now that's beginning to change, with RAMSI pulling out from police stations around the country and with RAMSI taking on a more advisory role. Hopefully we will see more of the Solomon Islands police force in the media, more of a more positive image of the Royal Solomon Islands.
There's two issues being discussed there, and one is that any development intervention needs to provide a solution that's fit for purpose. So there's no point in sending a model to a country that doesn't fit. And so if we're trying to create a police force in the Solomon Islands that can't operate because it can't afford fuel, then we've got a problem. So I think there's that issue, and it's worth discussing, because that happens in development interventions sometimes. It's not that anyone intends it to, but sometimes you try to impose a model that just doesn't quite fit. The second issue is that there, quite fairly, there has been criticisms of the RAMSI model because it created a parallel governance system in all of its aspects. Say maybe a parallel police force, perhaps a parallel parliamentary system, perhaps a parallel corrections system. And again, I think that's a valid concern and something that needs to be considered. I don't know what the solution is. I don't necessarily think it was a major fault of RAMSI. I think it's a lesson to be learnt, and I think it might be something you consider differently next time.
I wanted to pick up, if I can, the issue of trust, which has been raised, because I believe that to be a central issue within what we're talking about, and that's trust that's operating at a variety of different levels. And if for a moment we take a step back and say, what is trust about? It's about unequal power relations, but those that hold the power, and that might be a doctor in relation to a patient, it might be a donor in relation to a recipient country, are they exploiting and taking advantage of the power that they have, or are they providing an environment in which those who have lesser power within that relationship can operate in partnership and in the belief that the relationship is also operating in their interest. And the same applies whether one's talking about these institutions like a police force or a health service or a donor recipient country relationship. I think it's a key issue to get on top of. I also wanted to mention that in our own experience in following the tsunami in Aceh, an informant in a research study said to us that trust comes on foot. It takes a long time to build up, but it departs on horseback. So basically you can lose trust in a moment if you fail to deliver and you fail to ensure that there's consistency and you fail to reinforce the importance of the communities with which one's working. So I think it's a key issue to keep in mind, and that reinforces the long-term nature of these relationships and engagements. And it also perhaps is an appropriate time to talk about the G7+, which is a group of post-conflict and transitional states, which is putting on the agenda a set of issues around how the international community and donor community should be supporting them. And one of the key issues, again, is trust, but they're talking about transparency, reducing risks of violence, instability, using and strengthening national capacity and capability and those systems, and timely and predictable aid. And I think all of those are key elements that will help contribute to addressing some of the issues we've been talking about.
Okay, Joseph, there have been Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in Timor and Solomon Islands, and which you were involved in yourself. What do you see the role of these commissions? Can you tell us more about the work you've done?
The Truth Commission in the Solomons, it was a church-driven process right from the beginning, since early 2000. And it was, the churches were looking for ways of addressing issues around peace and reconciliation. So there was a nationwide dialogue in 2003 looking at the possibility of setting up an institution for creating a space whereby people could share their experiences around.
Why is this important? Why do you think countries like the Solomons needs this process?
I guess it's important for one obvious reason is to create a space for people to share their stories around the conflict, to know what happened and why. So in 2008, the state picked up the idea and enacted a legal framework for the establishment of a Truth Commission. And it went around the country documenting stories of people that were affected by or involved in the conflict. And recently, it produced a report last year, but recently it was unofficially published. So that's the stage in which the Commission has come.
Tarcisius, is it important? Is this process of truth and reconciliation an important one for post-conflict societies?
I think it does for two reasons. One is what Joseph said, that it provides an avenue for people to tell their stories. But I don't think it should stop there. In the case of the Solomon Islands, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has done the task that it's been mandated to do, that is to collect document stories. But I think there should be a shift beyond just people telling their stories. There should be a shift towards creating understanding, having mechanisms so that those stories can facilitate for reconciliation between communities as well as between individuals. That's the more important step, I think. And that step should be about understanding and reconciliation, not so much truth. Because in conflict situations, we can spend a lot of time fighting over what is true. And that in itself could create conflicts as well. But if we focus not so much on fighting over truth, but more in creating understanding, then that would be a positive step towards the right direction.
Okay, looking forward now, people within the Solomons and around the world broadly agree that RAMSI has been successful in stabilising the security situation in the country. But what needs to happen now, Joseph?
If you look at the conditions prior to 2003, there are improvements around law and order and also infrastructure and state mechanisms are strengthened as part of the RAMSI support. But some of the underlying conditions which you can say contributed to the Solomon Islands conflict is still there. So there are still issues around corruption, political interference, issues around exercise of ministerial power, and even service delivery, not only at the national level, but translating the delivery down to the village level. So those are still issues which, as a government and also as Solomon Islanders, we really need to organize ourselves and deal with these issues as part of the transition phase as well.
Rebecca, what needs to happen now?
So speaking for AusAID, the transition away from RAMSI commenced this month actually. So on the 1st of July, the RAMSI development program is in a stage of transition across to the Australian bilateral program. So the economic governance and law and justice and machinery of government aspects of RAMSI will move across. So nothing gets left behind. But we can't, it's not business as usual. RAMSI was very much about stabilisation in a post-conflict environment, and the new program really has to be about longer term development and poverty reduction. So that's the challenge ahead of us from an aid perspective.
Tarcisius, what do you think needs to happen post-RAMSI in the Solomons?
A lot of this discussion focuses on RAMSI or the intervening force, but there is also a need to focus on the Solomon Islands government. I think over the last 10 years, RAMSI has provided a condition for the Solomon Islands government to take control of things. I think in order for things to change, Solomon Islands government has to be much more proactive in saying, these are the things that we want to transition, these are the reasons why we want to transition this, and these are the objectives that we have in the next 10, 20 years. I suppose, and hopefully that discussion is taking place with AusAID and other bilateral donors. But I think it is important that Solomon Island leaders, both at the political level as well as at the senior administrative level, are much more proactive in this. Otherwise, the transition will be dictated by donors and the intervening force. So the discussion has to focus on the Solomon Islands government as well.
Okay, I think we've painted a really good picture about this issue. Let's move on to some questions, and we'll start with a question from Honiara, and this is addressed to the panel. A critique could be that RAMSI has overwhelmingly concentrated resources and energies on central state agencies based in Honiara. To what extent should international endeavours seek to formally engage with local non-state actors?
I think what really needs to happen is looking at what works on the ground in the Solomons. The local reality, the churches are actually one of the key actors. Pervasive nature of the state is very limited as compared to the churches. If you go to outside of Honiara, you will see the churches are quite visible as compared to the state or state institutions. So as a way forward, I think it's really important to engage with what works on the ground, and churches and community actors are important players in this process.
I think it's the importance of context sensitivity and context specificity, that in engaging in any of these environments, really having a good understanding of how society is structured, how government is working, what the role is of other actors, non-state actors, is really important, and building on what works and what can be strengthened and enhanced is a key issue. For any interventions, I would say though that one does need to think at these, or look at these multiple levels, that if all the focus, which is pretty common, is on the capital city and on central government, that there is neglect of other levels of government which are really responsible for delivering services at the periphery. If there's a failure to ensure that those services are also functioning effectively, and are delivering some peace dividend, basically, to the community. That one is rebuilding an inequitable society with rural and urban differences, and much of the resource inflow being captured by elites, often in the capital city, and I think that's very problematic. And I think one should perhaps also talk about the importance of other types of inequity and inequalities and disparities that need to be addressed in this period. So it's different layers of government, and it's between urban and rural, and gender equity amongst them is also an absolutely key issue to address.
This is a question from Dilly, directed at Tarcisius first. Timor-Leste and Solomon Islands both went through conflict and a transition period, and they're both now stable nation states. Is there really a best practice for peace building, not just peacekeeping?
That's a pretty difficult question. I'm not sure whether one could say that there is a best practice for everywhere. I think all these processes have context as well. East Timor, despite the similarities in a lot of ways, there are major differences between the Solomon Islands and East Timor, both in terms of the reasons for the conflict and the nature of conflict in East Timor. I think in a lot of cases, conflicts arise ultimately as a result of breakdown in relationship between people, between individuals as well as between groups. And in terms of peace building and maintenance of peace, it is about finding ways to rebuild, to strengthen these relationships. Institutions play a role in facilitating that. Institutions are not important in and of themselves. They are important in facilitating relationship between individuals and between communities. If we can do that in the case of the Solomon Islands or in the case of East Timor, then I think we are in the right direction. Things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission provide an opportunity for us to do it. But as I said earlier on, we should not simply have a report. We should find mechanisms to use that report to then facilitate the rebuilding and strengthening of relationship between people who were in conflict.
Can we open up to the floor in Sydney? Is there a question in Sydney?
I'd just like to pick up on a point that Rebecca made earlier about models for interventions, and just ask the panel, what are the key learnings from RAMSI, and what do you think are the most important factors for a successful intervention? If you were going to advise someone who was planning one, what would you say to them?
The very first thing I think is it's critically important that one country doesn't lead the intervention all on its own. I think that's, I think the regional nature of RAMSI is critically important to its success. And, that's not always going to be possible. However, I think regional models do have, better prospects for success than almost any other model. I think resourcing is really important. Interventions don't come cheap, that's the reality. And if you try to do it cheap, it's not going to work. I think it has to be long term. I don't think you can be in and out in 3 years. The classic, donor cycle of 3 or 4 year projects doesn't work when you're talking about a post-conflict intervention. We're talking about a generational intervention. In fact, 10 years may prove to be too short. Only history will tell us that. I think that it's really important that it's multifaceted. So when we talk about peace building isn't just about law and order. It's not just about people feeling safe when they're walking down the street, because there are triggers for conflict that exist beyond personal safety. If you don't have a functioning government that, where people feel they're represented and they have a voice, then you're going to have tensions. If you don't have revenues flowing fairly throughout the community, then you're going to have tensions. So I think it's important that the interventions have multiple aspects and that we don't just look at the law and order aspects, because that simply won't last.
For intervention forces to have a bit of flexibility, because conflicts are not often static, they're very dynamic. Conflicts change over time. And interventions often take place at a specific time in the history of a conflict and are designed to meet the needs and issues that arise at that time. However, when conflicts change, in some cases, intervention forces and their agendas are trapped within a particular period of time. So there must be a degree of flexibility so that you meet the new issues, the new agendas that come up as a result of changing conflicts.
Issues that have been mentioned, and it's interesting that across different countries one is reinforcing the same types of lessons and learnings. To some extent, the G7 Plus, which I referred to earlier, is picking up on these issues and trying to formulate effective responses that can be really supported by the international community at a variety of levels. So amongst those, for example, and one should pay tribute to Timor-Leste for really playing a major role in taking the G7 Plus forward and working with other post-conflict and fragile states to address this agenda and put it on the table, as well as those donors and others that are supporting that movement. But amongst the things that the G7 Plus has again sort of stated as key are around establishing legitimate politics, basically. So systems of governance and political systems which are legitimate and accountable, ensuring security, which we've already spoken about, and that's at a variety of different levels, with a strong emphasis on human security, so addressing inequalities becomes really important. Justice, economic foundations, and really revenue and services. So every one of those things which have been identified as key strands within a sort of peace and state building goals and objectives are key, and we should be learning from those and reinforcing those at a variety of levels from the get-go. I mean, basically, those can't be neglected, they need to be supported. The pace of different ones might vary, the forms of engagement might vary, depending on who the actors are in the different contexts, but they all need attention.
We have a question now from Papua New Guinea for Tarcisius. Arms in Bougainville continue to be a problem, despite the disarmament. High-powered arms are still present on the ground. What worked in the Solomon Islands that could work in Bougainville?
The difference between Bougainville and the Solomons is that in the case of the Solomons, we had a military and police component, armed military and police component. And one of the tasks that they had at the very beginning was that of disarmament. That wasn't the case in Bougainville. Bougainville, the surrender of arms was not enforced in the same way as we had in the Solomon Islands. So that's the major difference. The second issue is one has to ask the question of what are the underlying reasons for people in Bougainville to think that they continue to need to have arms, that there are underlying concerns that people probably have. And then the second question is how do we address those so that we can give reason for people to give up their arms. In the case of the Solomons, there was a major disarmament. There are still arms around, and there are still people who think that they need the guns that they have. So it's not complete disarmament.
Okay, a question from Dilly now, and this is directed at the panel. Based on the World Development Report of 2011, we know that it takes 20 to 30 years to emerge fully out of conflict. How can we ensure that the international community will stick around for that period, or should we even expect them to? Should the international community leave as soon as the country becomes stable?
The RAMSI intervention is good evidence for everyone of why it's in the interests of developed countries like Australia to remain engaged. And the cost of RAMSI over the last 10 years is in excess of $2 billion. The very last thing the Australian government wants is a return to conflict because it's costly and it will take years and years to regain what's lost. So I think it's, we don't like to talk about it very often, but it's in the national interests of countries like Australia, New Zealand, and other OECD donors to remain engaged to ensure that a return to conflict isn't possible.
I think the international community will always be involved. if it is not Australia or New Zealand, somebody else will be involved. And we've seen this in conflict places in Africa and other places. Sudan, for instance, you have the Chinese move in, the US move out, all kinds of international players. And so there will always be some form of international involvement. And international community or powerful nations are involved because of the conflict, but also because of broader geostrategic reasons as well that they have. And so there will always be involvement. The question for places like the Solomon Islands and Solomon Islands government or the East Timorese government and Papua New Guinea in the case of Bougainville is how does the Solomon Islands government or the local governments, national governments, capitalize on the international interest to be able to establish functioning institutions that work for their purposes rather than for that of the international community.
Just to highlight some of the problems within forms of funding and the way in which both humanitarian and development sort of funding and resources have operated in the past, which I think do contribute to the short-termism. So certainly humanitarian funding, which is often in a totally separate box, which might be around relief and supporting post-conflict, immediate post-conflict needs, etc., and development funding, which is much longer term, are often separated, and agencies and funding tranches and lines of support are fragmented, and I think that's problematic. So sort of thinking about how one can support both immediate and longer term needs, and when we're talking longer term, we're talking 5, 10 and beyond years. And it's very interesting to see, I think AusAID in the last year or two has certainly identified a number of sort of funding streams in the bilateral program, if I understand correctly, which now span something like an 8-year period rather than much shorter periods in the past. And that sort of thinking allows for really donors and country partners to start negotiating and agreeing partnerships that might change over time in terms of where the power lies. It gives a longer term opportunity for capacities and institutions to develop and to be fine-tuned and refined. And I think things like that are important developments at the present time which should be supported and backed.
We're running out of time, so if I could just ask for a question in Sydney, if you could direct it to one panellist, that would be great.
Thank you. Grace. I'm so much interested on the issue of reconciliation, Truth and Reconciliation program that you have introduced. But my question is, how was this introduced to the people? Was it the initiative? Does the culture of the people accept that as a means of building peace in the area? Because I feel that to build a sustainable peace needs the local people participation, the local institution like the cultural leaders, if they're there, the traditional leaders should be involved in spearheading the peace and reconciliation or the truth-telling process, if their cultures allows. I'm asking, is it their initiative that should be introduced in the community, or it was an initiative for an international community to try to probe the cause of the conflict and document and find way forward? Thank you.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the Solomons, it was a church-driven process. Right from a church-driven process right from the beginning. So, because during that time, the state was at the verge of collapsing, basically. So, the church was looking for ways in advocating for peace and also a healing process, and so that's basically the background to the idea of a Truth Commission. So the narratives around that time were, peace, love, forgiveness, which people in the Solomons are quite familiar with because of the presence of the state outside of urban centers, outside of Honiara. So it was something that people could easily relate to. There were also informal processes happening at the same time, apart from this whole discussion around a truth commission establishment. So you have women organizations that are also involved in the process of advocating for peace and reconciliation, which also feeds into this whole idea of a truth commission.
We've got a question from Honiara, and this one's for Tarcisius. Would a state/federal system of government help Solomon Islands avoid the risk of repeated conflict, or would it cause further disunity and division, having a state and federal system?
Thank you, Honiara. It seems I'm pretty popular today, but some of the problems that the Solomon Islands has is to do with the very institutions that we have. And one of the problems that we've had since RAMSI is rebuilding and strengthening institutions that prove not to function the way they should since independence. So perhaps the discussion should shift from strengthening institutions to finding institutions that work well in the context of the Solomon Islands. The state, to a certain extent, has contributed to some other, not the state in terms of government, but the institutions associated with the state, has contributed to some of the problems that underlie the conflict in terms of the distribution of development in rural areas, the concentration of development around places like Honiara and so forth. And so I think there is a broader discussion to be had in terms of looking at the kind of institutions or the kind of governance systems that can work in the Solomons, appropriate to Solomon Islands, and very importantly, affordable to the Solomon Islands context.
Just out of interest, with a constituency type base work in, for example, the Solomon Islands, because at the moment in a number of countries, the politicians are elected, but they're not directly responsive either through one talk and other means to particular client groups in a way, or populations.
Joseph, do you have an opinion? Would a state-federal system help the Solomons?
Yes, that's an interesting question. What's happening is people are trying to look for ways of addressing the current state establishment. They haven't really explored this whole idea of a provincial government. So there hasn't really been any amendments of the current state structure in terms of the provincial government system. And I guess this whole idea around a federal system is mainly to do with service delivery, sort of translating services from the national level down to the village level. And people feel that maybe with a change of government structure, there could be possibility of a more visible translation of services from the national level down to the provincial level. Because what is happening at the moment now is you have a provincial government system that's barely working, and now the government has introduced constituency development officers, which is a layer underneath the provincial government structure. So yeah, it's mainly around the delivery of services and sort of how people would benefit more from the sharing of revenue generated by resources. Yeah.
Thanks, Joseph. We've got a question for you actually from Papua New Guinea, and this one's from Amanda Watson. In PNG, village courts form the crucial backbone of the justice system there. Is there a similar village court system in Solomon Islands, and what did this mean for RAMSI? In
the Solomons, we have local courts, which is sort of quite similar to village courts in PNG, but we also have courts which is referred to as quasi-judicial courts, mainly chief's panel, which deal mainly with land dispute issues and also issues at the village level. These institutions, I guess, really need strengthening as well, because they are much more closer to the people compared to magistrate courts, which are set up in Honiara, and also our High Court, which is also in Honiara. The village courts and the chief's panel are structures that really need resources and state support.
Okay. That brings us to the end of our discussion, but please feel free to talk to our panellists afterwards. But before we do, can we please thank our panellists, Tarcisius Kabutaulaka, Rebecca Bryant, Joseph Foukona, and Professor Anthony Zwei. I'd also like to thank everyone joining us either here in Sydney or from afar. And remember, you can view this or any of the other Praxis discussions at worldbank.org/Praxis. Until next time, I'm Auskar Surbakti. Bye for now.